Welcome to American History Notes, where I read from the conclusions I've drawn from studying American history, things I've learned from studying American history, and I hope that you'll be interested in some of these things, even if you disagree with me, which I don't expect you to agree with me. But I do hope that you will, because you're interested in American history, that you will look it up, study it yourself, come to your own conclusions. Now, I'm going to discuss some things. We're talking about crime, punishment, and the law. So, police agencies operate within a system of values and priorities, sometimes based on political pressures, sometimes based on such things as limited operating funds or limited manpower. During the 1960s, when through the civil rights movement, the move away from social order into the rights of the individual was becoming supreme, many crimes were punished in a half hearted manner, and punishments were inconsistent at best. Punishment creates a cost for a crime, and the higher the cost, the less likely the crime is to be committed, is the conventional wisdom. But if the police bring people to heel for criminal behavior, and the courts aren't sentencing, and the prisons aren't keeping them, then a revolving door of sense of justice is perceived, and confidence in law enforcement wanes. On the other hand, with the quote war on drugs, so many people are housed in prison that for a time, next to the Soviet Union and South Africa, America had more of its population locked up than any other country. Now, this seems like a call to lessen the penalties for drug use and other crimes that aren't on the surface crimes against others as much as they are crimes against oneself. However, as was pointed out in William Bennett's book, Body Count, the average drug user in prison, and this is 20 years ago or more, is estimated to have committed over 200 other crimes in their criminal career. So keeping drug addicts and drug dealers off the street does have a positive effect, some would say. Using local and federal policing agencies to punish free speech and unpopular political ideals is another matter entirely. Two controversial and recent examples have been the so-called Ruby Ridge incident, where white separatist Randy Weaver's family was besieged by federal agents and his wife and his son were killed by federal snipers. The other was the so-called Waco massacre, when federal agents besieged a compound where the heavily armed religious group, the Branch Davidians, led by cult figure David Koresh, after several federal agents were murdered attempting to serve the arrest warrants. Um, Many of the cult members died after a fire in the compound, during which conspiracy theorists claim automatic weapons firing from outside, as in the federal agent side, are alleged to have killed many children, particularly. It's important to remember, however, that there are at least two sides to every story, and although the political left will state that police agencies, particularly federal, enforce the law out of political motivations, it would seem to be common sense that unless a group was either advocating violence or involved in outright crimes, that the FBI or other federal agencies would have little time to be concerned with them. Of course, now in the last few years, we've seen a use of the FBI as a political tool to condemn anyone who disagrees with the elite narrative, call them white supremacists or something like that. Um, as a freedom loving American, I want a strong system of checks and balances to prevent the abuse of police powers. There also has to be a willingness to let police agencies do their sworn job of defending our persons and property while safeguarding our rights. Still, with all that being said, it is a sad commentary on American society that the war on drugs gave America, with 5% of the world's population, nearly a quarter of the world's prison inmates at one time. According to the U.S. Bureau of Prison Statistics, half of all convicted of drug offenses in federal courts of 1999 were first-time offenders and received sentences averaging 4 years. Between 1990 and 2000, the federal prison population more than doubled, and more than half of those were for drug-related offenses. And I understand that it's gotten worse. Most drug arrests nationwide are for marijuana, and most of those are for simple possession, with more arrests reported for that in the year 2000. Again, we're talking 22 years ago, than all violent crimes combined. The U.S. imprisonment rate at that time, and I'm hoping this will encourage you to look at current statistics, the U.S. imprisonment rate at that time of 715 people per 100,000 was 6 times higher than Canada, 7.5 times higher than Germany, 9 times that of France. Until 1972, when President Nixon declared war on drugs, United States prison population rates were on a par with Europe. There were, in the first decade of this century, roughly 2 million people behind bars in the U.S., according to some sources, and that number isn't consistent with everyone I've read. America's crime rates were dropping before modern political leaders opted to not prosecute crimes, particularly in major cities. And some would say the reason the crime rates were dropping before the last few years was because we had a more strict stance toward drug use, and people under the influence of drugs commit more crimes. Therefore, we're keeping more potential and real criminals locked up. As a start of this century, I read that burglary, assault, and car theft were more common per population in Britain than here. With a society lacking the internal controls of pervasive religious belief we once had, there is little to keep a person who is predisposed to committing a crime from doing so if there is no fear of imprisonment. It is unlikely, however, for a person addicted to drugs that such a fear plays on his or her mind. There is a high level of minorities in prison population, which the political left insists is because policing is prejudiced against minorities, and in effect, they're being picked on. Whatever the case, 50% of the prison population is black, even though black people, African Americans, make up only 20% of the population. While the overall imprisonment rate for Americans was 702 per 100,000 at the beginning of the century, the imprisonment rate for black Americans was over 5 times that rate. Black men at the beginning of the century were 10 times more likely to go to jail than whites, and 1 in 20 over the age of 18 was in jail. Evidence of institutionalized racism and mass arrests, or evidence of a population more likely to commit crime? The argument on each side are many and from varied sources. So we're going to talk about some of the famous criminals and cops next time, and it's a lot to think about. And is there institutional racism? Are African Americans being picked on? Do the police focus on them rather than white people? I mean, these are all arguments that the left and the right batter back and forth. So let's talk about famous criminals, famous outlaws, and famous police next time, and make a few other comments and continue studying American history. I hope you'll study American history, come to your own conclusions. Thank you.